Well, welcome everybody. We're meeting today to have a look at the issue of assisted dying. And it is an issue that is of increasing concern in modern political debate, particularly in the Western world, but particularly in the United Kingdom at the present time. The Isle of Man has recently passed legislation that will introduce assisted dying with a number of significant constraints. And that was introduced only within the last few days. Experts argue that Scotland and Jersey may well follow the Isle of Man lead, and passing in at the moment, I think it's in committee stage, is the for England and Wales is a similar bill, a private members bill on this. So we have a number of experts here that will hopefully help you develop and shape your views on this issue. What I'm going to do first is introduce the speakers, and then we will there'll be a break, and then at the end of it all, of the speakers, we'll have a question and answer session. And I have a number of questions here that hopefully will help illuminate some of these issues. So first is Iain Brassington, who is a professor teaching medical ethics and philosophy of law at the Department of Law at Manchester. He is a philosopher by training and has published on ethical issues related to assisted dying for most of his career. Other research interests include the ethics of genetic technologies and the proper scope of genetic privacy rights. And he also has a sideline arguing against there being any such thing as rights of testamentary inheritance. Alexandra Mullock is senior lecturer in medical law at the University of Manchester. Alex is the co-director of the Centre for Social Ethics and Policy, and her research interests include end-of-life law and ethics, reproductive law and ethics, and the role of the criminal law in relation to harmful medical misconduct. Alex has undertaken policy and engagement work on assisted dying, supporting the government of Jersey and Nuffield Bioethics Council citizens' juries, co-authoring the ethical review of the proposed Jersey law in 2023, and giving oral evidence to the Health and Social Care Committee on the assisted dying and the Committee on the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill of 2024 to 5. And Nancy Preston is Professor of Supportive and Palliative Care and co-director of the International Observatory on End of Life Care in the Faculty of Health and Medicine at Lancaster University. Nancy is a world-leading researcher on the impact of assisted dying on families and healthcare workers through international research. She gave evidence to both the Health and Social Care Committees on assisted dying for the British and Irish governments and the Terminally Ill Adults Committee stage. She is co-chair of the European Association of Palliative Care's Task Force on the role of palliative care professionals in supporting patients and families seeking or accessing assisted dying. And I am Kevin Harrison, the least distinguished member of the panel, and my background is essentially in education, mainly politics and history in further and higher education. My interest in this is the issue of a concerned citizen. Like most people in this country, I am in favour of assisted dying, especially as a way of avoiding undue pain and suffering to loved ones and myself. Perhaps at some point in the future. But see the issue as surrounded by moral, legal and political issues that need to be thoroughly examined before action is taken. So I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction, very general, before we go on to the meat of this afternoon's meal, so to speak. Well, a friend of mine's mother, in her last illness and dying of cancer some years ago, was in great distress. And she declared to her daughter, I wish I was a dog. An animal in such distress as I am will be put out of its misery. And I was minded of this when the recent political debate over the proposed assisted dying bill began. Indeed, many of us state similar sentiments when talking on this issue to family and friends. Usually one needs to remind oneself at a time of good health and not suffering pain on the potential of this. Would we still hold the same views when we are actually in a end-of-life situation? Would we find life, however painful, as too precious to give up. Thus, for example, one gentleman in suffering from a terminal illness, being interviewed in a recent news item, pointed out that he changed his mind from wanting assisted suicide, assisted dying early in his illness, to being against it now that the illness has advanced still further along its progress. So one may reflect that this issue has changed in recent decades as social, moral and religious values have changed, not least the growing strength of individualism as an ideology. Why should a person not be able to decide the time of one's own demise? And as always with such social issues, the answer to this question is a complex one, and it reflects society and its values, religious, political, legal, and so on. Now, history certainly gives examples of societies where suicide is an acceptable way of ending one's life, often assisted by others. But it isn't a simple answer. In ancient Rome, for example, there was no stigma at all attached to suicide. It was, I think it was Seneca who argued that life was like a feast, and one might reasonably decide when one can push one chair back, stand up and leave the table. And indeed, in certainly elite Roman culture, ending one's own life at a time of one's choosing was a perfectly honourable thing to do. So, for example, one hostage taken to try and influence decisions of Julius Caesar killed himself in order that those influences on his leader would not take place. Others, defeat in war, committed suicide. Brutus and Cassius, assassins of Caesar, are examples of that. Similarly, Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And also, Roman emperors would order people to commit suicide when they, rather than to be killed by the emperor. This was a means by which their families could also then protect their property. So the Seneca, who we've already mentioned, and Lucan, his nephew, and others were ordered to end their own lives after having been implicated in a plot to kill the Emperor Nero. And in one sense, it was assisted dying. They would be surrounded by their family, their friends, and trying to state famous last words as their life ebbed away. Now, this began to change dramatically with the spread of Christianity. And indeed, the fundamental issue here is that life is a gift from God, and only God could take life, aside of sanctioned, religiously sanctioned situations such as criminal punishment and warfare. And as a result, there was a massive stigma attached to suicide, whether assisted or not. A suicide could not be buried in consecrated ground. Suicides in some countries were buried at crossroads with a stake through their heart to stop their spirits walking. In England at one time, attempted suicide was itself a capital offence, which is one of those strange ironies of history and law. And so, in one sense, one may assume that in the past, suicide and assisted dying would be unrepresented in the figures. Partly because relatives would try and cover it up, but also coroners would be reluctant to bring a verdict of suicide at inquests. And indeed, helping someone to end their life was a criminal offence, which led to some well-publicised cases of family members who have helped a loved one to die being forced to undergo extra stress of a trial. And interestingly, these days, the verdict rarely involves the prison sentence, but such cases may have grown in recent decades, along with increased lifespan and more people living long enough to suffer long, painful, and terminal illness. And law here often clashes with moral views and popular opinion of ending suffering and helping people carry out a right to do with their own life as they will, especially to avoid suffering. It also reflects the decline, perhaps, of formal Christianity as a belief system in modern Western societies, particularly countries like Britain. Practicing Christians, it can be argued, can choose to adhere to the principle of God-given life, but we're in a society where a majority of people polled now take a view of the importance of individual choice in avoiding suffering. Indeed, this has often been identified by social science researchers as being a reflection of society and its values, perhaps the most famous of which is that of Emil Durkheim back at the end of the 19th century, where he saw quite a close correlation between Protestant countries, which tended to have higher suicide rates, than Catholic countries, which tended to have lower suicide rates. And indeed, that these issues are related very closely to individuals' values as part of a general values in society. Indeed, other cultures such as Japan, suicide was often the means of ending a life that had been tainted by dishonor. So, as we see, the concepts of honor, the protection of others, a reasoned and rational response to a situation where there is ultimately no way out of, say, a terminal illness apart from extending pain, or even for that matter, grey areas. A soldier who takes military action and gets killed defending his colleagues. How many heroes are, in other circumstances, people who in one maybe seen as being involved in a suicidal activity? And it's not one other element well. It's not just individual choice, many would argue. After all, the individual is part of a wider society of friends, of family, of colleagues. They're part of a social web of people that create a society. It also related to law and is defined and constrained by law. And law, to varying degrees, reflects the social, religious, and moral values of people. Now, suicide of the sort I've just been talking about is not automatically the same as assisted dying. Indeed, Kim Ledbetter has argued that one should make a clear distinction between these two. In Canada, for example, it's called medical assistance in dying, and this is generally related to the idea of people making choices, adult, rational people, about when to end their lives, or when, with help from others in some circumstances, to end their lives, without criminal penalties to those who help a friend or a family to leave this life at a point of their own choosing, in order to avoid undue pain, discomfort, or being a burden to others, or losing their own dignity towards the end of their life. And indeed, countries like Canada are identified. I think they've had assisted dying since 2016, if I remember correctly, where in the first year about 1,000 people opted for medical assistance in dying, as it's called in Canada. By 2023, this was over 15,000 people in Canada. Around 4.3% of all deaths in Canada were some form of assisted dying. Indeed, interestingly, in Quebec, it was in 2023, 7.6% of people in Quebec, deaths in Quebec, were assisted dying. Indeed, support in Quebec is significantly higher for assisted suicide, at 86% in one recent poll, than Canada at large, where it's running at 75%. So, and that has been widened in recent years, and this is an issue that certainly our speakers will make an address to. Certainly, if you look at the United Kingdom, there are significant majorities in opinion polls that favour reform to the law to allow assisted dying. It remains illegal to assist a suicide. Courts, though, as I say, often recognise particular circumstances and leniency towards some individuals, often a spouse ending the life of a loved one rather than watching them suffer at the request of that loved one as well. One recent study calculated that roughly one person a week travels from the United Kingdom to Switzerland, where assisted dying has been legal for now 80 years. But that is expensive, and people often face police investigations on their return. But also, quite worryingly, 600 people a year commit suicide to avoid incriminating loved ones in their end, often starving themselves to death or denying access to water as well. This is a significant toll of misery that could be reduced. And we're now in a process related to the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill that may form a basis for change in the law, introduced by Kim Ledbetter, MP. It is a cross-party issue, as we will see, where you find Labour, Conservative, Liberals, Brexiteers, Remainers forming alliances on pro and anti stances on the bill, making a huge number of amendments to it as it goes through its process. And so that will, for England and Wales, form the core of any likely change to the legislation on this issue. And so I think without further ado, let us press on to the people who know a great deal more about these issues to hear their contribution to this. So I will start, if possible, with Iain on this issue and his views on it.
Okay, thanks. Right, so I'm going to I will talk about the ethical arguments underneath the law rather than any particular substantive legal claims, because that's Alex's area of expertise. And you've already raised implicitly quite a lot of the stuff that I was going to mention. I think it's important, as we get started, about being clear, always when we're talking about the morals of any particular action, then it's important to get clear about precisely what's being talked about. So we can draw a distinction, as you indicated, between assisted suicide on one hand, and that's one kind of assisted dying, and euthanasia on the other. So the Leadbeater bill that's currently before Parliament, or the Lord Falconer's bill that was introduced in August, but is now, I suspect, pretty much defunct, they all have to do with assisted suicide and one person being allowed to assist in another person's self-killing. So that's one kind of assisted dying, but euthanasia would be entirely different. That would not be covered by any of the legislation being considered in the UK or the territories around the UK. So when we're talking about things like the Leadbeater Act, we're talking about what amounts to an alteration of the Suicide Act. Essentially, it's a matter of giving a person a defence against a charge of assisting in another person's suicide. Actually killing another person is still off the agenda, and no one is really talking about euthanasia within a legislative context in the UK. Okay, so with that proviso made, there's likely to be two related but distinct families of questions when we're talking about assisted dying, or when we talk about whether assisted dying should be permitted or legalised. And one has to do with the permissibility of Alice is helping Bob to kill himself, and the other has to do with the permissibility of Charlie killing Diane, and they're qualitatively different kind of things. So in respect of assisted suicide, where Alice is helping Bob to kill himself, then it's tempting to say that, as you indicated, well, people have the rights to control their own lives, people could end their own lives if they see fit, therefore it follows that assistance should be permitted. But that doesn't actually quite follow, because whatever we want to say about the permissibility of killing oneself, when we're talking about assisted suicide, there's another person involved, and so the arguments are going to be slightly different. Likewise, if we're talking about euthanasia, where this is one person actually killing another person, nothing that we say about assisted dying will necessarily commit us to anything about euthanasia. We could hold that one is permissible and that the other isn't. So I believe, and I'm not an expert on Belgian law, I'm about to get into terrible hot water here, but I believe that in Belgium, they legalised euthanasia without legalising assisted dying. And the rationale there is essentially that they've got a Good Samaritan law that says that if you see someone about to end their own lives, then you have an obligation to intervene to support them. But that's obviously inconsistent with having assisted suicide. So you can kill someone, but you can't help them kill themselves in Belgium. And there are arguments in terms of whether that makes much sense, but again, we'll just park that and leave listeners to make up their own minds about that. That said, although there are these different sets of questions, they are related, and many of the same concerns are raised. you indicated in your introduction that a lot of what's going on has to do with something like respect for autonomy, a person's control over their own life and how it unfolds and how it ends. So the thought here is going to be along the lines that if people are sovereign over their own lives, then this implies that they have a right to control what happens in their lives. And again, a further implication of that is that they have the right to control what happens and the way that life ends. If people are sovereign over their own lives, then they are sovereign over their own deaths. And that's the kind of standard argument that works. And again, if you look at the way that assisted dying legislation has been introduced in the UK, that's the sort of rationale. If you look at the parliamentary debates, a couple of them over the last few months, that's the sort of rationale that's the main bell that's been rung. Now, again, I don't think that argument quite works. And there's a number of questions that we might want to ask about it. So on a deep conceptual level, we might wonder whether it's true that people are really sovereign over their own lives, or if sovereignty is the right kind of sovereignty in this kind of context. So what does it mean to say that people are self-sovereign? You might want to say, for example, that even if people do have substantially great control, or even if people ought to be recognized as having substantially great control over their own lives, nevertheless, we can't recognize people as kind of atomic units completely isolated from everyone else. That we might want to say that we are part of a community, that everyone is bound together, and therefore individual claims or claims about individual rights that sort of take for granted a sort of purely sovereign individual simply misunderstand what it is to be human. So all the rights claims that we might want to make may become a bit too easily. But even if you don't want to go that far, even if you're not that kind of communitarian, then we still can't leap easily from claims about sovereignty over your own life to claims about how the law should deal with assisted dying. And the reason for that is fairly straightforwardly that I think all those autonomy arguments are easy to overplay. We ought to be wary of overplaying them. And the thought here runs along these lines, which let's suppose that we're satisfied that a person does have rights to control their own death, or a prima facie reason to control their own death. That might tell us something about the moral permissibility of their own ending it. And again, that's going to be reflected in questions about the legal permissibility of suicide or attempted suicide. And you mentioned that the Suicide Act, which decriminalised attempts to end your own life in the early 60s. So that's fine, and that's great as far as it goes. But assisted suicide is something different. That involves another person. So we can perhaps say that, of course, the law should not be criminalising suicide for all kinds of reasons. But that doesn't mean that we think that suicide is a good idea. And it's perfectly coherent to have a decriminalisation of suicide without wanting to decriminalise assistance, because we still might want to say that suicide is bad, and helping other people to commit suicide is, for that reason, something that the law ought to be involved with. And it's crucial when it comes to using the autonomy argument to assisted dying, or in support of assisted dying, to remember that the whole point of assisted dying is that it is assisted, right? So it means that other people are involved. And so, to that extent, the role of autonomy, I think, is likely to be slightly diluted. And it's obviously going to be important, or autonomy is going to be important in as much as that no one should be able to kill me or assist in my death without my say-so. So it's important that my autonomy be preserved in that sense. But it doesn't follow from that my autonomy gives anyone a warrant to assist in my death. It's not at all obvious to me that my autonomous choice is going to show that anyone else may be involved in my death. This does raise some problems, though. So if cases like Tony Nicholson, Tony Nicholson was in the news a few years ago because he'd been left quadriplegic after a massive stroke. He decided that his life was no longer worth living, that he wanted assistance to end that life. But granted the nature of his disability, all he could do under the law as it stood was to refuse nutrition and hydration. And the argument there is that seems terribly inhumane, that essentially we are forcing people to if they want to die, we're forcing them into an unpleasant death that they would otherwise have rejected, simply because the only way that they can end their own is this particularly unpleasant way, and that seems kind of inhumane. On the other hand, we may want to bite this bullet. We may want to say, look, there is a moral Rubicon here whereby we simply do not help other people to die. And if they misfortune is such that they cannot die without, or cannot die in a comfortable way without our assistance, then that we can admit that that's a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily follow that the law has to change, because maybe the law, for other reasons, ought to tolerate these particular anomalous outcomes. Maybe then the argument has less, or if we want to talk about legalization of assistance, we ought to be talking less about autonomy and rights to end one's own life and rights to have other people involved in ending one's own life as a more straightforward welfare claim. So the thought is going to be here that if your life is a burden to you, or if Smith's life is a burden to Smith, or Jones' life is a burden to Jones, and if we think that if a person thinks that it'd be better that he no longer live that life, then we've got a reason to help, not because of any claims about autonomy, although autonomy would be a condition, a necessary condition for permissibility, but the moral force would be carried by welfare claims. So someone is suffering, therefore we've got a reason to intervene. And that's going to help us with the Nicholson problem. It's going to help us to say, well, look, he's suffering from his predicament, and suffering is bad, therefore we've got a reason to intervene. So the weight of the argument there is going to be carried by the goodness of relieving someone of their misery. But then there's still counter arguments to that. So in one counter argument is to say, well, that's fine, but that's not an argument for assisted dying. That's an argument for removing a person's suffering. And if there are ways to remove suffering without killing them, or without bringing about their death, then we ought to go for that. So one possibility would be a technique called continuous deep sedation. And this, in essence, is a situation in which we put someone into a coma that lasts for the rest of their natural life. And if we think there's something special about human life, and if we think there's something morally problematic about killing another human being, and that doesn't seem like so wild a claim to make, a lot of people do have that intuition. So if we think that killing people is bad, then this gives us a way to end their suffering without actually having to cross the line of killing them. We can mean that the suffering goes away and goes away forever. But they are still alive. It is potentially irreversible. So we could imagine a situation in which we have some medical breakthrough. We think we can repair whatever has gone wrong in their life. So we could potentially bring them round and ask them if they would be if they would go for the medical treatment. All this kind of stuff about about finality and avoiding the finality of death. On the other hand, I suppose the counter argument is that there's a dignity claim here. So if you might think, well, this is going to make the suffering go away physiologically, but there's a harm to be had in my simply being attached to a machine for an indefinitely long period, right? So, and that might be deemed to be sufficiently corrosive of welfare, not in a physical sense, but in a kind of intellectual or existential sense, if you like. And that itself would be something that we would want to avoid. The other aspect of what appeals to welfare, again, you touched on this in your introduction, has to do with appeals, the kind of stereotype, well, you wouldn't let a dog live like this kind of thing. So again, there's something, again, quite intuitively powerful that if ending suffering is bad, that's why we think that euthanasia is permissible in respect of pets. We tend to love our pets in something that is appreciably like the way that we love our family. So why can't we use the same kind of argument here? I guess the response to that is going to be, well, okay, fair enough. You wouldn't let a dog live like that, but isn't there something special about human life? And importantly, if we are taking our dog to the vet for the final time, it doesn't get a choice in the matter, and so the analogy doesn't quite work unless you're willing to entertain a situation in which we decide on Aunt Mabel's behalf that she's had quite enough of this, thank you very much. And that doesn't seem to be like, that's a slightly strange position to find ourselves in. And that would bring us back to autonomy claims, the idea that, well, okay, maybe Aunt Mabel has a veto on this kind of stuff. The other problem when we're making appeals to autonomy is that we would want to make sure that any request for assistance in dying is genuine. And there might be worries about how we can make sure of that, how we can be absolutely certain that a person genuinely does want to die. Might the circumstances in which we find themselves make a difference? So, for example, might it be the case that the availability of palliative care is going to make a difference to how powerful the draw of assistance in dying is? If a person is aware that palliative care is available and is accessible, then they might not be quite so keen on assisted dying as they thought they were. So the thought here is that maybe assisted dying is the least bad option rather than something that they positively want. And if that's the case, and if ending human lives is a bad thing, then the proper response to suffering might be to ensure that palliation is there rather than that we're assisting in their dying. And this is, although I'm generally fairly sympathetic to the arguments in favour of assisted dying, this is a big concern that I have with the Leadbeater Bill, which is that the way it's been framed, it allows medical staff to raise the possibility of assisted dying. And that seems to me to be deeply problematic, because implicitly we could imagine a situation, effectively, I'm caricaturing slightly, but in which a doctor says, well, we could do A or we could do B, or have you thought about ending your life? And implicitly, that's the doctor saying to potentially quite vulnerable people that, well, you know what, from my expert position, your life is no longer worth living. In other words, we're going to be coerced into accepting something that they wouldn't otherwise be had. So again, like I said, I'm caricaturing a little bit, but that worry that the idea comes from outside of the patient or comes from a third party is going to alter the situation in which the decision is being made, and it may not be altering it to the good. Final thought here is that all the assisted dying laws that are being considered in the UK have been limited to terminal illness cases, and generally speaking, around the world, a lot of so in Oregon and California, it's all to do with terminal illness cases. One question might be to do with why that should be. So if we go back to something like the Nicholson case, so he'd had this stroke, he was locked in, but he wasn't terminally ill. Assuming that he was still fed and watered, then he was potentially going to live for an indefinitely long time. So there might be questions to raise about whether terminal illness really is a necessary criterion for candidacy for assisted dying. Why not widen the candidacy? But if we're going to widen the candidacy, then the question might be, well, how far are we going to widen it? What would we allow candidacy for the sake of disability, for the sake of chronic illness? What about mental illness? Is that the kind of thing where we would consider someone for assisted dying? So it's one thing to say, well, look, if you're severely disabled and you find your life intolerable, then that may give us a reason. But imagine that you go through phases of florid psychosis, and during one of your lucid phases, you decide that this is just not a game that you want to play anymore. Would that be sufficient? Would that count as grounds for assisted dying? And then you can kind of get to potentially slightly absurd outcomes, such as severe toothache. Is that the kind of thing that would warrant assisted dying? And if we're taking a strong autonomy line and saying that people are sovereign over their own lives and over their own deaths, then it's not obvious why we would want to, if someone's faced with the prospect of yet another root canal operation, why they would not just say nuts to this. And that seems crazy. So how do you draw the line between this kind of candidacy that we're going to permit and the kind of candidacy that we're not going to permit? What about Weltschmerz? What about world weariness? People who just kind of say, well, I've had enough. Is this the kind of thing that would allow for candidacy for assisted dying? So there's all these open questions, and I'm trying to stay agnostic and neutral about all this kind of stuff. But if we are going to have an assisted dying law, it's got to draw lines somewhere. So there is always going to be a question about whether we've drawn those lines in the right place. And I think that's probably quite enough from me.
Well, thank you, Iain. That was some amazing and fascinating.
I did go on a bit, didn't I?
No. On the contrary, it raised all sorts of things I'd not even remotely began to think about on this, and where, particularly the issues of where you draw the line. Speaking of someone with a minor case of toothache at the moment, I'm not sure I'd wanted that to be an issue. But all the idea of world weariness, it's an interesting one that. There, or minor or illnesses like the Nicholson case, or situation like the Nicholson case, where he's not terminal, but he's had enough.
Yeah.
And who decides, whether the life is worth living? And of course, I'm glad you raised the issue, which we'll discuss no doubt at greater length at the end, the idea how, well, the famous slippery slope argument, how it slides into euthanasia, where in that chilling phrase of the bad guys from the 30s, certain groups were, what was it, were life unworthy of life. And who decides that? Do you want to give anybody that sort of power? Except, of course, as you mentioned, with modern technology and drugs, you've already given people that sort of power to some degree, called doctors. Anyway, enough on that. That was excellent. So, Alex, over to you. I think you're in two parts with a break in the middle. So you choose the point, and then we'll have a short break.
Okay.
So over to you.
Thank you to you both for your fascinating talks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill, which I think everyone must have heard about unless you've been living in, an isolated community over the last year or so. So I'm going to talk, first of all, a little bit about the background and a series of bills which have been presented, mainly in the House of Lords over the last few years, which have sought to legalise assisted dying. And by assisted dying, what they actually mean is medical assistance in suicide. And then I'm going to talk about specifically the Kim Leadbeater Private Members Bill. Then I'm going to look at who'll be eligible and about assessing the eligibility and who decides who might be able to access lawful assisted dying, and those arrangements and the crucial role of the two doctors. Before I'll talk briefly about the legal authorization that this law would require, and then the final act of potentially helping somebody to self-ingest the fatal medication. So over the past, particularly 3 decades, there have been a series of bills which have attempted to make assisted dying lawful. In fact, though, this goes back much further, and we can see early attempts going back to the 1930s. And so this is not a new issue. For many years, a very keen campaign group have been attempting to change the law. But attempts have really intensified over recent years. So going back to the 90s and the noughties, a member of the House of Lords, Lord Joffe, attempted to first of all make either assisting a suicide or euthanasia lawful. Then we've had several attempts brought by Lord Falconer, Charlie Falconer, who was previously a member of the Labour government. And then more recently, Baroness Meacher attempted to change the law. And then the most recent attempt in the House of Lords was brought by Lord Falconer. Iain mentioned this, and I understand that bill was withdrawn from the House of Lords when Kim Leadbeater introduced her bill into the House of Commons. In the House of Commons in 2015, there was a private members bill introduced by Rob Maris MP, and this bill was defeated by a significant majority at the second reading. And then bringing us up to date, in autumn last year, Kim Leadbeater MP introduced her bill. It's interesting that the name of the bill has been adapted. So previously, the most recent bills were called the Assisted Dying Bill, but Kim Leadbeater has called her bill the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill. I guess in an attempt to be a bit more specific about the types of people who would be eligible, and limiting it to only the terminally ill, because as you may be aware, one of the most sort of prominent groups who were opposed to legalization are people living with disability, and the fear that lawful assisted dying would expand and have a very detrimental effect on those communities has been a key reason why many people do oppose a change in the law. So who would be eligible under the Terminally Ill Adults Bill? It's limited to adults who have mental capacity and who are terminally ill from a somatic or physical disease that's not treatable in terms of allowing them to have a cure for the disease, and is also expected to prove fatal within 6 months or less. So not included in the Leadbeater Bill is anyone under the age of 18, or a person suffering from a non-terminal condition, or anyone who is deemed to lack mental capacity, or deemed to have been coerced or pressured to seek help to die. So in that sense, it's quite a restrictive approach. It's quite interesting to compare it to other jurisdictions that have made the choice to make assisted dying legal. And the Leadbeater approach, when compared to those other approaches in different countries, is more restrictive than many. It aligns with an approach that's been happening for many years in the US state of Oregon and some other US states, and also more recent jurisdictions that have changed the law, such as Victoria in Australia, or indeed New Zealand. So just to have a look at the process that the bill outlines, it's a fairly lengthy process with quite a bit of bureaucracy. So I've kind of simplified it because it's an extremely long piece of potential legislation, but it begins with an initial discussion where a person raises that the issue that they would like to have help to die to presumably a doctor. If that doctor isn't in a position to help them, either because they're unable or unwilling, then they will need to refuse and put the person in touch with a doctor who is willing. And then this will be a formal first declaration of a request to have help to die. And this needs to be made to a coordinating doctor. And that's the most important doctor in this process, really, because they oversee the process. And they also assess the patient, and they have to make a formal statement before a period of reflection of 7 days, where the person is supposed to reflect on their wishes and reconsider before, if they decide to continue, there'll be a second doctor involved in the process who will also assess them. And then if they are happy that the person should be permitted to go forward, they will have a formal declaration or report saying that. The next stage is then legal authorization. So this is prospective legal authorization. In the first draft of the Leadbeater Bill, the plan was to have the High Court do this, but since then that has been removed, and it looks now, although we don't have, a very clear sense of which amendments have been agreed, it looks that the approach is going to involve a multidisciplinary panel or tribunal. If the tribunal or panel then agree that the person ought to be helped, there will then be a second period of reflection of 14 days, which is then followed, if the patient or person still wants to have the assisted death, by a second declaration where the coordinating doctor and another person who's an independent witness make a formal statement saying that the person should get the help that they want. And then finally, there will be the provision of assistance where the doctor or the registered medical practitioner will get the approved substance, which is obviously the fatal drugs, and then support the patient to end their own life. So it's quite a long process. So looking at those, the very important role of the doctors involved in this process, the bill outlines that in the initial discussions with the person who wants to die, the doctor has no obligation to raise the possibility of assisted dying, but they are free to do so without being asked. And Iain pointed out that this is a potentially concerning aspect of the bill, because there's an argument that if your doctor raises a possible option for you, that you might see that as a recommendation or a suggestion, or even if you take it as it is, which is one of several possible options, it might make a patient worried that the doctor fears for them that their natural death, even with palliative care, will be very, very unpleasant. And so that might make the patient feel more afraid, and they're more likely to want to have an assisted death. If the doctor is unwilling or unable when asked for help to die, then under the Leadbeater Bill, there is an obligation to refer the person to another doctor who they would be willing to help. And this has been flagged by some as very problematic, because the whole concept of referral within the medical profession has a clear meaning, which might have an unfortunate effect of making a doctor feel that they are complicit, whereas in fact they have a religious or a moral objection to facilitating assisted dying. It looks in reality more common that a distinct assisted dying service will be established, and in that case then willing doctors will effectively opt in to the service by becoming involved. So I think in actual fact these problems about doctors who might be unwilling or unable to help will be dealt with by establishing a service. So looking at the doctor's assessment, the two doctors involved both must assess the patient's health and be sure that they are terminally ill of a condition that's expected to kill them within 6 months, and also that they have mental capacity. And then the last thing that they need to be sure of is that the person is acting from their own motivations, and they haven't been coerced or pressured by another to seek assisted dying. So that's some very difficult questions that the two doctors have to be sure of before they make the statement or the report agreeing that the person should be given the help to die. The next stage then would be the prospective legal authorization, and this is a very unusual approach. The vast majority of places all around the world that allow assisted dying do not require prospective legal authorization. I think there are 2 exceptions, and Spain is the most relevant because they have a sort of panel approach where a doctor and a lawyer have to agree that the necessary steps have been complied with. So this approach was initially to have a High Court judge authorize the permission to assist someone to die, but this has since been dropped in the committee stage, and now it seems to be that a multidisciplinary panel with oversight by an assisted dying commissioner, who will be a High Court judge or a judge of the Court of Appeal or Supreme Court, they will oversee the application and say yes or no. If they say no, there will be a right to appeal to the Commissioner or to the High Court. So the next step, if both doctors have agreed and the multidisciplinary panel or tribunal have agreed, is to provide the person with help to self-ingest fatal drugs. So the coordinating doctor must have control of the drugs at all times, which is a safeguard that's not present in all jurisdictions allowing assisted suicide. So for example, in Oregon, it's not necessary for the patient to have supervision necessarily in self-ingesting, and this has been flagged as a danger. So the Leadbeater Bill proposes that the doctor would supervise the approved substance, prepare the substance, and if necessary, a device to enable self-administration. So for example, if somebody had a condition which prevented them from physically self-administering a condition such as advanced motor neuron disease, then a device could be prepared, and the doctor would help the patient to with a supported approach to doing the final step, which then led to the administration of the substance. And that might come perilously close, in many people's view, to a form of euthanasia and actually killing a person rather than a person taking their own life. So that's one concern that is apparent here. Then the doctor must remain with the patient until they die, unless, of course, the patient changes their mind, in which case, obviously, the drugs must be taken away. And then if the patient self-ingests and dies, then the doctor should complete a final statement. Now, one of the important concerns that has been raised, and I'll talk more about this afterwards in relation to my experiences with the citizens' juries, is that sometimes people don't die straight away, and sometimes there are complications. So one concern is that, what would the doctor do if a patient, there was a problem, and for example, if the patient vomited up the medication and survived, what would be the most ethical response to that type of problem, and should the law need to state what ought to be done in that situation? And this is my final slide. So looking at the process, it's a lengthy, a fairly bureaucratic process that's envisaged under this law at the moment. It seems likely to take at least 6 to 8 weeks with the 2 reflection periods. And since only those who are expected to die within 6 months can start the process, it might be quite challenging to fit all this in. Of course, the fact that somebody has a terminal illness expected to prove fatal in 6 months is in itself a tricky question, and lots of people have argued that actually it's impossible to predict death with any form of accuracy at that point in time. It's only when a person is much, much closer to the natural end of their life that it becomes feasible to say, oh yes, this person might die within a certain time frame. And we've probably all heard stories of people who were given a certain amount of time to live and they're still alive, 3 years later. And certainly that happens, but equally it's true that somebody who's given 6 months to live may die within a month. So how feasible is it to have an approach that seems to demand significant time and effort from a dying person? Is it, as Chris Whitty flagged in his committee evidence back in January, is it going to be a system that's mired in bureaucracy and therefore problematic? Or on the other hand, are the safeguards and the multiple assessments and the formalities required within the law, are these essential for a safe approach, which will enable only people who are really determined to take this route to go ahead with it? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. That's going to raise some interesting issues about you need complicated and strong systems to make sure that any system is not abused. And as you say, we don't know how long many people will actually live when diagnosed with a terminal illness. But even before you got to that slide, it struck me that for many people, this is a process that will end with their natural death rather than any assisted dying. And I'd always had the imagination of assisted dying being relatively quick. And I can see why it should not be. But on the other hand, if you are in pain, why do you want to be, and you made the decision, why should you be forced in many ways to stretch this out for 8 weeks? Indeed, it may even encourage people simply not bother with this route and then find another way of finishing their lives early. But that's something we can look at again later. But that is very interesting. So thank you again for that.
So the second talk I'm going to give is about my role on the citizens' juries in Jersey and more recently in England. And I'm thinking really about the role of public policy participation in shaping policy on assisted dying. So along with another legal academic, Professor Suzanne Ost from Lancaster University, we were legal advisors to the Jersey Citizens Jury in 2020. Well, it was actually 2021. And then 2 years later, in 2023, I co-authored the ethical review of the Jersey law proposals. Then last year, Suzanne and I reprised our roles, but in a slightly different way, when we both supported the Nuffield Citizens Jury, which was the first English citizens jury on assisted dying. So this is a form of public engagement and public participation, with the idea being that it's really important to find out what ordinary people think about contentious issues. And this can be done in a variety of ways. Opinion polls, provide a snapshot and a sort of superficial overview about what people might think. Referendums are often used as well. So, for example, in the Republic of Ireland, when they were deciding whether or not to make abortion laws more liberal and relaxed to give women better access to abortion, they had a referendum. And this was obviously informed by public campaigns and stuff on the media. And then a more intense way, involving obviously far fewer people, but a much more in-depth exercise, is to have citizens' juries. So on the issue of assisted dying, approximately 70% of the British population believe that assisted dying should be lawful in certain situations. And this is a kind of long-standing phenomenon. So, over the past couple of decades, since I started following this, opinion polls routinely say that somewhere between 65 and 80% of the public believe that assisted dying should be lawful. So the most recent, or one of the most recent ones, was done in the autumn of 2024 by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, who are the organisation who arranged the citizens' jury. They found that approximately 70% of the British population think assisted dying should be lawful. But people often disparage the importance of opinion polls, and they question whether people really understand enough about an issue to be able to, provide a meaningful sense of what the public and the general public believe about something. On assisted dying, there's evidence that actually there is quite a lot of confusion about what it means, and there is confusion. Again, this was a study done by Nuffield last year. There's quite a lot of confusion with assisted dying and palliative care, for example. And people who are opposed to assisted dying have often argued that if people really understood it and the implications of it, they probably wouldn't support it. So there's good reason, it's argued, not to take on board these opinion polls, because they come from a place of misunderstanding what it means, or not really understanding the full implications of lawful assisted dying. So one way to improve understanding is to get a group of lay people together and educate them about a particular issue, and then ask them what they think. And so that's exactly what was done, first of all, in Jersey. So the series of events in Jersey is that campaigners for assisted dying organised an e-petition, which many people signed, and then they presented it to the then health minister in Jersey. And they then committed to hold a citizens' jury and also to follow the decision that the jury made about whether or not assisted dying should be lawful in Jersey. And the question that the jurors were asked was whether assisted dying should be permitted in Jersey, and if so, under what circumstances. So they selected the jury by a process known as sortition, where they send out information to a large group of people, and then from volunteers they sort potential jurors to be reflective of the population in terms of gender, age, ethnicity, and also in terms of what their view about the particular issue is. So the jurors that were selected were representative of Jersey views on assisted dying, which meant that the majority to begin the process were in favour of assisted dying. And so there were 23 jurors in the Jersey process. And they sat through many, many hours of evidence over, I think it was 3 months, in which they had 3-hour meetings where particular issues were covered. So, for example, in one of the meetings, we heard evidence from jurisdictions where assisted dying is lawful. In another meeting, they heard evidence from doctors, palliative care doctors, and doctors who were either opposed or in favour of lawful assisted dying. And the evidence was very balanced to make sure that they got a very objective sense of the evidence that wasn't skewed either in favour or against allowing assisted dying. At the end of that process, the jurors voted on whether assisted dying should be permitted in Jersey, and 3/4 of the jury voted in favour of allowing both medically assisted suicide and euthanasia for terminally ill people and for those suffering unbearably. So this was quite a liberal approach, following the sort of model of lawful assisted dying that we see in countries like the Netherlands, Canada and Belgium, rather than the more restrictive approach that we've talked about earlier in the Leadbeater bill. So the original proposal in Jersey was to have 2 routes. The first was for people who were terminally ill and expected to die in 6 months, or if they had a neurological condition such as motor neurone disease, then they would be given, it would be open for people who might be given approximately 12 months to live. And then the second route was for adults suffering unbearably, but not from a terminal condition. And this route would need court approval, so prospective legal authorization. Then, following the ethical review of the Jersey law in 2023, there was a vote in the Jersey Parliament, which is their state's assembly. They voted in favour of accepting Route 1 for terminally ill people, but they voted against allowing it for people who are not terminally ill. And so the Jersey plans are now being developed on that basis. So more recently, I was then invited to be involved in the Nuffield Council of Bioethics English Citizens Jury, which was convened about a year ago in spring 2024. The question that the jury were asked to consider was, should the law in England, and by England actually they mean England and Wales potentially, be changed to permit assisted dying? And that's obviously because when we talk about English law, we mean law that applies in England and Wales, but not Scotland, because they have a separate legal system, and potentially in Northern Ireland, although that gets quite complicated, and I won't go into the kind of constitutional traditions of all that. But effectively, the jury sat during spring and early summer of last year, and just like the Jersey jury, they heard hours and hours of very balanced evidence across a range of issues. And then in June 2024, they voted on the results, and 2/3 of the jurors were in favour of permitting medically assisted suicide and euthanasia for terminally ill people. Interestingly, they didn't confine the eligibility in the jury exercise to adults. and they suggested that we should be open to allowing people who are not yet aged 18 to access assisted dying in the event of terminal illness. There were 30 jurors involved in this process, and in the final vote, because some people were ill, I think there were 28 present. So the English citizens jury were also asked to give a sense of what their main concerns are to inform the debate. And they identified them as empathy, compassion for people who might be suffering and dying, and also making sure that the ethics of any lawful assisted dying are carefully considered. They were also very concerned about protecting vulnerable people who might be put at risk in the event that assisted dying is lawful. Thirdly, they were very keen that any approach should respect the autonomy and self-governance of individuals. And they also highlighted the need for a national conversation to feed into developments about assisted dying. Also, not present on this slide, they were very concerned to make sure that palliative care was improved, and they saw palliative care as crucially important within the debate, because if there isn't good enough palliative care, people who otherwise wouldn't want to die early might feel compelled because it's the only option for a good death. So this is my final slide. Reflecting on both exercises and the value of this kind of lay democratic participation, both juries debunked the myth that if people understand more about assisted dying, they're far more likely to oppose it. A small minority of both jurors did change their minds from the beginning of the process, but we saw this happening in both directions. So, for example, a very small number of people who said they weren't sure or they were opposed to assisted dying changed their mind and became more supportive, whilst similarly, change happened in the other direction as well. So understanding more about assisted dying didn't generally change jurors' views, but it did enable them to engage with the nuances of the debate. And the extent to which both these juries have contributed to the debates about whether assisted dying should become lawful in Jersey and in England and Wales has been quite variable. So obviously in Jersey there was a firm commitment by the Jersey government to respect the views of the jurors, whilst in England this exercise was done by a very important organisation who are obviously not part of the state in terms of the Nuffield Bioethics Council's role, and they are hoping that the exercise and the work that the juries did will inform debate on this very important issue. And that's it for me for now. Thank you.
Well, again, I get some very interesting points about the role of getting ordinary citizens involved in such a complicated issue, and probably discovering they understand this more than many people would otherwise think they do. Well, thank you again. So, without further ado, let's go on to Nancy. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So really what I'm going to talk about is what can we learn from what happens in practice from other jurisdictions. So a lot of the debate is ethical, hypothetical. This is kind of trying to learn from people who've been involved in an assisted death, what it was like for them, whether they're a healthcare professional or a bereaved family member. Just on this slide, it's to kind of show the growth in assisted dying legislation. And you know, for a long time, it really was Oregon, Switzerland, and the Benelux countries. And then it started to grow, and it's grown, and it's grown, and it's grown. And so I think we can see now that more and more jurisdictions have brought this in. And this is causing challenges. It's also causing a big question about how should we implement this. And at the moment, a lot of the debate is not very focused on the how. And hopefully you'll hear some of the issues in the how from what we've learned from other countries. So the first thing we did was some research with healthcare professionals who were caring for people who were undergoing an assisted death. Now, some of them may be involved just in their general care, and others were directly involved in assisting the death. So in the Netherlands, we interviewed people from hospices and also staff from care homes. In a lot of countries, assisted dying happens in the home. It doesn't happen in hospitals. But the Belgium, Netherlands may be a bit different, and Canada, but the vast majority of places, really, this is something that happens in the home. So when we interviewed this doctor, they said to us, I can discuss with the patient, with the team, and agree it's the best option, but to take away the life in a moment and inject the medication, that's something else. I'm still not ready for it. So the ideas of conscientious objection are a little bit more nuanced. So people may understand it, may agree with it, but they don't want to be involved as a healthcare professional. Another person said, I had a colleague who was all for it, and I can't do it anymore. Because even if you're in favour of it, it becomes a burden when you do it 3 or 4 times. It's stressful to kill somebody. And we often don't think about the people involved on this side of the debate who would actually be enacting a change in the law. The big thing that came across was this was never a normal death. Now think about care homes and hospices. Dying is pretty normal. But for them, these deaths were not normal. It's a little bit strange that someone is going to die tomorrow at 7 o'clock. It's very strange. They talked about these as a death that stayed with you. They could talk about a room that whenever they went in it, they remembered the person who had died. There's a quote here from a doctor who talks about when there was an assisted death, it's really important to arrange support for yourself. They talk about going out and having a drink so you've got something to do in the evening. Some people will say take the rest of the afternoon off. Can you imagine that in the NHS? They talked about some people being able to do that for 6 cases a year, and they said, well, I just couldn't imagine doing that. I can manage 1 or 2 a year, and it takes me that long to get over it. So these were often the people who are really caring for people day to day, unlike perhaps in Canada, where you have the MAID teams who might go around as a service, which is potentially where the UK is going, who are volunteering to take on this role, or in Switzerland, where they have Right to Die association doctors or volunteer doctors taking this on. It was very much seen as part of care, but there was a recognition about optimising palliative care resolve many of the requests. And I think one of the concerns with the bill for us is that there's no obligation that you would speak to someone with a palliative care background, because it's not just that they could help manage your symptoms and manage your death. They can also debunk and hopefully reduce the fears you have. You may have seen a bad death, but that might not be the death you're going to have. And most doctors are really poor at having these conversations. Palliative care doctors, palliative care nurses, these are very used to these conversations and can have them with compassion and help people understand what they might be facing. But in the Netherlands, they saw this as a continuum of care. So this person said euthanasia is something that is part of a treatment trajectory you go through together as a patient and as a physician. It feels wrong if patients can go to a clinic getting their euthanasia as a sort of product. It shouldn't be like that. In Washington State, which is a bit like Oregon, similar laws, we interviewed staff who had gone through or helped people with an assisted death. As this person says, who is a medical social worker, I find the intersection between death with dignity and hospice really interesting. But the reality is most people that are doing it are on hospice, but it's uncharted territory for our culture. A lot of the hospices will not allow patients to either have an assisted death in their building or even allow the staff to talk about it, which, as this medical social worker said, it's really difficult because I can't talk to the patients. And the cost of the medications is very high in the US, and we think that's partly because the pharmaceutical companies don't want to be associated with it. There's also issues in trying to find a pharmacist to dispense the drugs because they don't want to be complicit in the act either. And we looked at how people really saw this, as whether this was suicide. We've talked about suicide a lot today, and right on the far extreme of suicide was gunshots and intentional overdose, whereas things like use of sedation or withdrawal of treatment or voluntary stopping eating and drinking were seen much, much more as a natural death. If there's no discussion, it can really cause problems. So here was someone said he had a fear of getting into pain, so I'm not sure if he trusted us in hospice that we could mitigate the pain if he got into it. He shot himself in the head. He left a suicide note and apologised to his family for leaving a mess. We never saw it coming. There was no depression notable leading to his suicide. And the number of staff who had walked in and found someone after a gunshot injury or has helped a family was really quite shocking. In Switzerland, palliative care doctors we interviewed, there really is a big role here for institutional conscientious objection. We often think about the individual doctor, but whole hospitals have opted out. They rarely allow it in the hospital. A few that do allow their staff to perform it, but most, if they do allow it, they will bring in Right to Die Association doctors to perform the act. But pretty much most people are opting out of it. Again, happens in the home. The law there is very vague. It's just saying that you can assist someone to die, and doctors have some guidelines, but they talked about being a legal vacuum. But they actually quite liked that because it made it easier to refuse to be involved. In fact, none of the palliative care doctors we spoke to did prescribe or did even do assessments, and they really tried to stop the conversation about assisted dying, telling them that there was palliative care options. As one person said, though, it is the responsibility of the palliative care professionals to hear and explore the implicit or explicit requests for euthanasia and address the suffering underlying these requests. So they're taking a palliative care approach, they're not taking an assisted dying approach. So we almost saw a continuum of involvement from that I can't be involved and literally will not discuss it, or I'll discuss it, but nothing else. I'll assess, but I can't prescribe. I can do 1 or 2 a year, or for some people, they felt okay. Part of the bill that Alex was talking about, the need to find another doctor, that's really challenging. There's a huge secrecy in this and a taboo. Anyone in palliative care who does get involved often doesn't admit to it because they're fearful how it will go down for their career. They're not sure how it'll be viewed by others. Research with bereaved family members revealed that there was sort of 5 phases to making the decision for the assisted death, and this came out of our interviews in Switzerland. So there was this contemplation where the patient really ruminated on this on their own. Then they feel that they want to get someone to help them and gain acceptance, and they share it with 1 or 2 key people. Again, there is secrecy. This is not widely shared. This is something really quite difficult, and you don't want to have to explain this to 20 people. The next part was getting permission from the healthcare worker, and this is when it became really difficult to navigate, try to find someone who was actually going to help you do the assessments, to help you get the prescription and go through the whole process. And then there was organising it, and this is where the Right to Die associations came in, which is quite a unique feature of Switzerland, where they pretty much have taken this out of healthcare. And then there was the aftermath, which I'll talk about, where the bereavement, because of the secrecy, could cause problems. But a big element was to respect their wishes, even if you don't agree. That's how family members who supported felt. So the process for the families, he left good. He left as he wanted, surrounded as he wanted. So the bereavement has gone fine. And overall, our research has shown pretty positive elements on bereavement. But as this other person said, the violence is there too. A different violence compared to a natural death or a classic suicide. It's there, but it's spread over the people. We also interviewed British families who'd been to predominantly Dignitas to gain an assisted death. And again, this isolation that came about because of the secrecy when you're helping someone was really paramount. So whilst they were helping them, they had a lot of anxiety about the illegality of the act. And they also felt they had to suspend their feelings. This was all about the patient and not them. There was also this sort of stigma of suicide, which was quite difficult to deal with. However, after the death, they felt this real element of campaigning, that they could lessen their anxiety now because the act had happened. They could start to open up and challenge the stigma of suicide and felt power in joining with others. But I thought just some quotes just so you could understand what it's like going through the death. So this was just before the death, and this was a British family. So everything about it was just heightened. Every moment becomes really precious. It's impossible to believe that this living person in front of me is going to be dead in a few hours. Just impossible. That evening was very hard because we had a meal together, her last dinner. Neither of us was very hungry, but we had a glass of wine. She joked that it was her last supper. And it's quite amazing what people talked about, this unnaturalness of this, knowing what was going to happen. Then we talk about the dying, and Alex talked about how long this can happen. In Switzerland, they're pretty much now putting up a drip and the person opens the drip. But in this case, they had orally swallowed the medication. So this family member said, the worst bit for me was she started being sick because it tastes very, very bitter. But then she said, I feel woozy, and we got her on the bed. We tried to lie her down, but they said, keep her upright for a bit so the drugs can go through her body. Then she lay down, went into a deep sleep, and after 20 minutes, the physician said, she's gone. It just happened very quickly, and she just left. It was peaceful, but it stayed with me. Now, if you compare that death to, say, Oregon, with a different concoction of drugs, these deaths can take an hour, 3 hours, sometimes 6 hours, and sometimes fail. So there's a real issue about what drugs are we using and what drugs would we use if this was implemented. Then there's something about the aftermath, and this quote sort of sums it up. That was tough because I had to deal with the emotional responses for all these people I didn't really know very well. People had known my mother had been very ill, and some people wrote to say that they felt her choice was quite understandable. Others seemed very shocked and disappointed, and that they had not known about her pain before she died. And there's this real feeling that it's left to the family member to manage the expectations of the family. Sometimes those discussions were pre the death, or whether there were fallouts with family members who didn't agree, but often it came after the death where that person was then acting on their behalf. So the concerns going forward, so are we going to find enough clinicians who are willing to do it? Are we going to find enough institutions who are willing to allow this to happen? There's a real fear of healthcare professionals about being involved may lead to attack, which has been expressed in Australia. Fear that if they're supportive, it will go against their career, and even pharmacology companies and pharmacists having concerns. How do you also support those involved? So we need support for the staff who are involved. And in Australia, they have a care coordinator for the assisted dying. But there needs to be real support for the patients and the family, both during and after the death. And that has got to include the people who were unaware this was an assisted death, and it may have impacted them differently. At the moment, the NHS is in crisis, and there's leaks coming out that if this is to be legalised, this will not happen in the NHS. So some sort of service, and a bit like how abortion is taking place, is predominantly outside of the NHS, may well be what happens. It may be that they'd go the Swiss route, where there's a big role for right to die associations. But at the moment, the practical elements of introducing this bill are incredibly challenging.
Another layer of complexity, and one on the face it seems at the beginning when I first started looking at this, there's a simple choice that an individual might have, and its implications are enormous. It's interesting you mentioned about the idea that doctors may have an option to opt out, which is perfectly reasonable. I'm just wondering what criteria in those countries that have these systems of panels of volunteer doctors, what criteria do they have for choosing them? I mean, I know it may sound rather like some sort of bizarre TV film, but one wonders about the sort of person that might volunteer to want to get into a job killing people. And you might want to weed those people out of that. And I was quite surprised again that in Switzerland, with the image, it's almost like a free-for-all. Anybody turning up, I want to go. There are whole hospitals that opt out of this system. So again, another layer of complexity there. Right, so we have quite a bit of time here for any questions. But for a start, I'd just like to ask any members of the panel here whether there's any comments they want to add or to raise their own questions to the other two members from what they've heard in their presentations.
Just on the with my ethicist hat, and I think that last point about how you choose doctors who are willing to. You're right. There's kind of something intuitively a bit queasy making about someone who is too enthusiastic to do this kind of stuff. So I mean, it strikes me that in any sort of permissible legal system, you could end up with a situation in which the law says that assisted dying, whether it be euthanasia or assisted suicide, is perfectly legal, and there is as few regulations as you can imagine, and yet it still never happens because no one is willing to be the doctor who presses the plunger, in which case, unless you think that there is a positive right to be assisted, then there's not much that you can do about it. Now in Canada, particularly in Ontario, there is a bankable right, if not to be assisted, then at least to be referred on to a medical practitioner who will assist. So there's much more leverage that the patient has under that system. But in the proposed UK legislation, then yeah, we could imagine a situation in which all the legal boxes have been ticked, and yet it just doesn't happen because there's no bankable right.
And which, eating in still further, looking for such people,
Yeah.
that 6 to 8 weeks it takes may become 6 months trying to find.
I think they had that in Australia because they had really tight laws originally, and your qualifications to do it meant that virtually nobody, almost, if you had a really unusual condition, it was very, very hard to find someone, and they absolutely did time out. I think they then, the next lot of states had slightly more relaxed laws. But I think the British Medical Association have made it really clear they want a system outside of healthcare. So whether that's teams that can come into the hospitals or it's something more like the Swiss situation with Right to Die volunteers doing this. These are doctors who are volunteering. And I think for them, they often feel it's a real altruism in doing that. They're doing what the person wants. And I think as well, people imagine it might be your GP doing it. Well, it's unlikely. Apart from anything else, they won't have the time to sit with you whilst you go through the assisted death, which is the case in this law. But the people didn't really mind who did it. What they wanted was to get the assisted death. And because it was done with compassion in Switzerland, it didn't matter if it was a doctor you didn't know.
And it might also be that either formally or informally, people involved in assisted dying, doctors and nurses, may only be expected to do a handful a year. So the potential psychological damage of, we're not talking of teams that might be going in doing this job every day of their working lives.
Although in Canada, it's possibly getting a bit like that. I think because it's like of the 5,000 deaths, is it 60 or 80? I can't remember what it is, but it's done by very few people.
Right. So there is a danger of that. And I assume they would also then need some sort of psychological support if this is likely to be a problem, like in some professions like counselling, where you have to have a counsellor to keep an eye on you, taking on board that stuff. Again, several questions here that I have, many of which have actually been answered as we've gone along here. Certainly, one that I would like to raise is again this issue that more general one really, but it's one that as I'm now moving into the age bracket myself, that struck me, the concern that the elderly themselves, who by their very nature may only have a few more years, may find themselves with illnesses that could prolong their life, being put under pressure by who? Family members, whatever. And of course, more chillingly, the idea that at some point down the line, governments desperate to save money upon long-term care may create changes in the regulations, if not the law, to allow this to be easier. And examples that struck me about. There's almost a culture in the media of using terms to describe the elderly, but actually quite derogatory, which if used about any other group, bed brockers, codgers, duffers, how privileged the elderly are, and so on. They're not sitting in their big houses. What about the young? That they may, and how expensive they are, and how little they do. That the idea that they may well become a culture created inadvertently that encourages people to move towards that. Now the law may be changed. This leads on to a question that one of the people invited to see this program mentioned, that well, two things. One, how likely is the legislation in England and Wales to pass, and if so, when? I understand it's going to be going almost endless amendments at the present time, but do you personally think it is actually going to come into law, and if so, when? And having said that, once it is in law, and I'm going to raise this other question, what safeguards will be put in place so that this or future governments do not change the parameters around the criteria for assisted dying, the slippery slope argument? I suppose under our legislation that could simply be changed by regulations or changes to the legislation, but perhaps people are looking for more safeguards than initially would be the case, and making this sound more complicated than it is. First, one, how likely is it to pass? And secondly, what sort of protections are there against the slippery slope argument?
You're the expert on the first one, Alex.
Well, gosh, I wouldn't go that far, but I think, my sense of it is that, so it's going to go to report stage and third reading, I think on the 25th of April. And looking at how people voted in the second reading back in November, I think it was something like 250 to 330 or thereabouts. If 30 odd people change their minds and either, against it, then it will fail. But there's a chance that some people who voted against it might now want to vote for it. I think it's more likely that more people who voted for it to give it chance at committee stage will now look at it and say, actually, no. So I think it's going to be really tight, but I think my view is it probably will squeak through. But then, it could change again if it does progress onto the House of Lords. They'll have the opportunity to amend it. It might run out of time because opponents might want to kind of, run down the clock. Although I understand, from anecdotally that shouldn't happen. Who knows?
I'm a bit less. I'm a bit. I tend to think it's less likely to pass. And the reason for that is I think that there is. I think, as Alex says, it doesn't need that many people to change their minds to shift them. Although the majority was superficially fairly healthy on the second reading. But I think there is some degree of in which people allow it to pass a second reading to allow it to go to the committee. But my sense is also from sort of vibes I'm picking on social media as much as anything, but there's a lot of MPs who are kind of really quite hacked off about how the committee stage has been handled. And they think that the committee has been loaded in one particular way, that there's been amendments kind of strung on through, or amendments made from critics that have been equally rejected in a fairly perfunctory sort of way. So it may be that people who are sympathetic to the content of the law may end up vote against it out of pique, really, about the way it's being pursued, because there is this argument to say, well, look, if it does pass in April, given that it was only introduced to the Commons in November, that's less than 6 months for what is morally astounding. If you think about the amount of time that's spent considering, altering council tax or something like that, it gets months and months and months and months, and it can take a very, very long time. And yet we've got this kind of thing where it's a fundamental change to the nature of the right to life, or people's rights to assist another person's dying, and 6 months are all done, including a Christmas break. Dumph. And I think people there is a few MPs that with whom I'm in contact who've kind of gone, it's just too quick.
Yeah. And if you look at other private members' bills, say in the 60s, that brought about massive changes in the law in connection with divorce and abortion and homosexual law reform, they may have been private members' bills, I think all of them, but they were passed at the end of many, many years of reports and investigations from Wolfson to the homosexual law reform. And also, of course, they had the backing of the government that could then throw in resources to make sure this is properly constituted, polished, legislation. I understand with private members' bill, it's almost left up to the MP and a few friends to get the thing sorted, which isn't necessarily ideal when, as you say, you're dealing with something as enormously complex and important, even more, for me, even more so than I thought an hour ago, yeah, that it's been done so quickly.
And I think there is a delay, though, they're now talking about. So Stephen Kinnock, the Minister for Palliative Care, initially there was going to be a 2 to 3 implementation period. It's now going to be 4 years. And they've actually said during the committee stage, because the government has concerns about some of the vagueness in the bill. And I think some of the vagueness is purposeful, so it could be shaped at the next stage. But also, it's obviously going to raise concerns for how do you implement this. And obviously, the Secretary of State for Health, Wes Streeting, is against passing it round now, because we know it's a very difficult time for the health service. And we've done much more minor things that have gone horribly wrong at the end of life, like the Liverpool Care Pathway, which didn't have much of an evidence base, but where the problems really came was the implementation, the practical elements, and we end up with the Daily Mail campaign against it, and the Daily Mail and the Times and the Telegraph are already coming down quite hard against the bill. So you do this wrong, this could go very, very wrong.
Yeah. That's again. So that largely deals with those questions. I don't recall, and I may have missed it, that there are other elements as well. I came across one article, or part of an article, and the Ledbetter or Leadbeater bill doesn't seem to have it in it, as I understand it, the idea of the need for equity impact assessments in this, because I think it is in Canada where certain groups, particularly poor white males, seem to be polished off with their the assisted dying scheme more statistically than any other group, and that's another issue to see, because we know our law in practice can discriminate against certain groups, even of course these days that's never an intention. It can be an actual result of that, and that doesn't seem to be in this legislation at all.
Yeah, it speaks to your point earlier about a moment ago about safeguarding and can we avoid the elderly and the vulnerable being pressured into something that they wouldn't have taken on. Now, I think that there is a certain amount of, for my money, shroud waving about, the government is facing social care costs, and we could just push elderly people into the suicide chambers. Yeah. And I think that is over-egged, but and also, one of the reasons why I think it's over-egged is because I think that simply because you're elderly or simply because you're disabled, it doesn't mean that you're utterly biddable. You can be just as mulish as a younger person or an able-bodied person. So there is, some of those concerns I think are overplayed, but that does not mean that they're utterly irrelevant. Yeah. There was about 10, 15 years ago, there's an interview that Baroness Warnock gave to the Church of Scotland magazine, in which she just kind of moved it almost as a passing thought that there might be such a thing as a right to, as a duty to die, and she's basically saying that there comes a point where you possibly morally decent people would recognise that they're a burden on the people around them, and it was just a kind of parenthetical comment, and it was in the context of a discussion about other stuff, and the Daily Mail got hold of it. Baroness Warnock says duty to die. Oh yes. And you kind of get this idea that that there will be almost, a bloke outside your house with a stopwatch going, well, that's your 70 years and 10, mate, off we go. So there's a kind of caricature concern, which, and any bill, we have to make sure that there is not a slippery slope. I think it is avoidable, but it does have to be exactly clear what's going on, and that even if we think that there is a moral, that there are moral reasons for people to accept that they are being able, it doesn't follow from that anyone else can make the point for them. No. So that's
I think it's what's interesting looking around the world is a few years ago in the Netherlands, which has got one of the most liberal approaches in the world, there was a campaign to expand eligibility to older people who passed the age of 70 and who were tired of life. And this was a really prominent campaign. I guess it was around 2008, 2009, around that time. And in the Netherlands, what's really interesting is that the legal change was very much supported by the medical profession, because the way they frame their obligations is that if somebody is suffering terribly and they've tried other ways to help that person and that person wants to die, then there is this kind of professional medical obligation to provide euthanasia. But they didn't want to go, and step over into this sort of even more inclusive approach of allowing people just based on their age and the fact that they were a bit tired and fed up to access it. So I guess that's encouraging in that, given that the Netherlands have literally it's arguable about whether they've expanded it or whether actually the place that they're at now in terms of allowing people to have it after a time when they don't have mental capacity, because you can have an advanced decision to request euthanasia when you have dementia, for example, and obviously expanding it to include people with mental health illnesses and expanding it in terms of children. People would argue in support of what's happened in the Netherlands, well, actually, they haven't really expanded it. It's just that the way the sort of due care criteria is interpreted, this was never explicitly prohibited. It's just that we weren't quite sure. However, they were sure that they didn't want to expand it to include older people who are tired of life. So and that was an interesting one, that if they haven't gone there, I'd be very, very surprised if a much more restrictive approach ever went that far.
Yeah, I mean, the Netherlands is an interesting case because there's two things to say about that. In the first place, obviously, a lot of people, I think, think that euthanasia has been legal in the Netherlands for decades and decades and decades, and of course it hasn't. It was tolerated by the law for a long time, and then in 2002, the law was essentially a matter of formalising what had already happened, and this speaks to doctors treating it as being part of the medical role. So again, there's a sort of moral claim rather than necessarily a legal claim, and the law caught up with it. But the flip side of that is that there is also in the Netherlands, and this speaks to the flip side of the vulnerable elderly people point as well, there is something called the Groningen Protocol, which deals with what amounts to non-voluntary euthanasia for children. And the rationale there is simply if a child is suffering, a neonate is suffering terribly or is expected to live a nasty and short life, then it falls within the medical remit to save them from this burdensome life, and therefore there is non-voluntary euthanasia for children. And again, the Dutch law does not permit that, except that it kind of does. So if we're talking about vulnerability, a lot of the attention in the UK has been on the elderly, but exactly the same kinds of reasons could be brought to the table in respect to the very young. And there's the sound of me, and the sound you can hear in the background is me opening an enormous can of worms, and they're slithering all over the table as we speak.
I think even with dementia, that's a can of worms as well. So although you can have, it's gone through the courts now, you can have an advance directive. What it comes down to is the doctor now is making the decision that your life is unbearable, and at what point that happens. They had the trial case where they had they wanted to test the law, so they gave someone some sedation within their coffee, but unfortunately they woke up and they were held down and euthanized, and this went through the courts, and the decision was the doctor can decide when someone's life is unbearable. Now that is a massive change in where we have come from, and of course doctors have opted out of that, so very few doctors will take that decision. So there's a few people who are willing to follow someone through and make that decision, but again it comes down to, we might feel as a society we want something, is it practically possible, and are you going to find people to do it? Except
Of course, often doctors make decisions about whether a life is worth living anyway. So if you're wheeled into A&E having been in a road accident, and the doctors might very well decide we are not even going to begin treatment with this because it would be burdensome. So already doctors are making decisions about lives worth living on behalf of other people. So yeah, intuitively there's something different about the assisted dying sort of context. And I think there is an important moral difference between a doctor deciding not to start what they hold to be a burdensome treatment, even if it preserves life for a predictable time. But yeah, there's something weird about the ways that we kind of accept doctors making that sort of decision on a Tuesday and then on a Wednesday.
But there's a difference between withdrawal and actively injecting the drug. I think that's for the doctor. That's where they see the difference.
Yeah. I think that would probably have to be what it is. But again, this prediction about lives worth living.
Yeah.
They are making that decision on behalf of someone else, and that's again, I think often the decision about this permissibility of assisted dying, it's got actually much less to do with the patient than intuitively we might think. And a lot of it has to do with the doctor and what they're willing to do and what they think is permitted.
And what they know.
And what they know. Yeah.
And the idea, I just struck with the idea of the tide of life bit. You know, it always tells this image of some older person being fed up. But quite often opinion polls show that the older age group are amongst the happiest of the generations. How many teenagers do we know are fed up with life and then grow out of it? I mean, I don't know how you would calculate, you know, how that would be acceptable to help that person end their life when they're in what may be simply a temporary depression in their life.
Yeah, and there's concerns about this, sometimes known as the Werther phenomenon. So this was apparently when Goethe published his novel The Sorrows of Young Werther. There was a kind of spate of fashionable suicides because they were also this kind of romantic hero, and it's what you do. But yeah, so people can be pressured to, especially young people can be very young people, he said it in a patronising kind of way, but they can be very impressionable and do really, really strange things.
Yeah, and indeed, so-called rational adults can do very strange things. And interestingly as well, that's something that very temporary. You know, years ago, I came across an article which argued that suicide rise in the UK following Conservative election victories. At the rate, and then falls when Labour wins. Only temporarily, then it gets back to the sort of norm there. So again, it's quite interesting, and that's another thing to hear that we're looking at here. So yeah, I assume this legislation, if it got through, wouldn't remove from people the right to go to Switzerland and Dignitas. That would still be an option.
And we know that people still do that from countries where it has been legitimised, and that's a really interesting question, why they are doing that.
Yeah, and of course, given we're coming to the end of the time here, but one thing that I came across, that the large numbers of people, several hundred a year, ending their lives because of ill health, terminally ill health, is such legislation really necessary? Given that those who really feel the need to go and leave this life because of a terminal illness or something like that, will find a way to do that, and are doing already, irrespective of what the law says, and will find friends, family members willing to help them, and then take the consequences.
I think one of the things in some Belgian research, where they were interviewing people with mental health conditions about why they were trying to access an assisted death, and these were people who had repeatedly tried to kill themselves, they said one of the big elements for them was, A, it would work. They knew 100% it would work, so there wouldn't be any long-term problems of being in ICU and all the rest of it. But also, it was much more acceptable because it was a doctor doing something. It was a medical act. It wasn't suicide. And it made it much more acceptable for the family, for the bereavement, and everybody after. And I think really this is what a lot of this is about.
Yeah, and that's not a world away in some ways from the doctor going to the next of kin and asking their permission to switch off a life support machine. They made a judgment that person is never going to recover. They just need legally to ask somebody, can I switch off this machine? And I suppose in certain circumstances, they can switch it off anyway, without anybody's agreement. Yeah. So it's going to get a very interesting and complicated topic. Right, we've got probably one. We've already passed the time on my watch. Are there any final comments you might want to make before we complete today? I think almost everything has been said.
It's all been
that
said.
Needs to be said. I think many of us need to go away now and digest what all of you said. So I'd just like to join everybody else who's been involved in this in thanking you three for your contributions today. And I found it personally fascinating and has made me want to find out more about this issue, irrespective of what happens to this piece of legislation. And certainly I'll be following it more in the future in the newspapers than I have done in the past. So once again, thank you very much, and thank you all for being involved in this today and watching it, and hopefully any future events you'll be involved in that as well. So bye for now, and enjoy the rest of the day.